You good? Yeah. Involving individuals from North Korea posing as non-North Korean nationals while applying for remote work. So what could happen if you hired a contractor who's a North Korean national? Well, besides the fact that they could be a Chilima, like we heard about in the talk an hour ago, and cause data theft and extortion or another type of incident, this could also cause you reputational and regulatory impact if you were to find out and the public were to find out. And additionally, you could face sanctions under US and your UN authorities. So thanks for joining me today for this session, Impersonation Protocol. My name is Russell Mosley, and I'm a professional services manager at CrowdStrike on the strategic risk advisory team. What that means in short is that I help our clients with proactive consulting engagements, doing things like cybersecurity maturity assessments, SOC assessments, ransomware readiness, that sort of thing, and tabletop exercises, which are my very favorite. I want to clarify that I am not a lawyer. Some of the things I'm going to mention, you should definitely talk to your legal team about because they may or not be okay in your jurisdiction. I'm also not here speaking on behalf of CrowdStrike. I am here on my own dime, and these are my recommendations, not CrowdStrike's. Additionally, as you can see there, I really enjoy BSides conferences and practitioner cons. I help run the BSides in Baltimore, BSides Charm, and I'm a director with the Blue Team Village at DEF CON. And last but not least, because I know that Pittsburgh, people from Pittsburgh are very serious about their sports teams. I'm a huge Penguins fan. I grew up in Washington, PA. That's me at the Penguins, one of their Stanley Cup parties, I think after the 2016 Cup. But I'm super excited to be here. I've known about BSides Pittsburgh for a number of years. Never got around to submitting a talk or coming up, and finally saw an opportunity this year. So I wanted to thank you for having me. All right, so we're going to talk about this problem of impersonation and what to do about it. To get started, I'm going to explain the problem as I've experienced it firsthand over the years as a security practitioner, and then talk about some examples of impersonation. Then we're going to talk about some possible mitigation steps, the foundation of which were really developed by my CIO and I at a previous job, and we dubbed it Impersonation Protocol. This is essentially a playbook for impersonation cases. And since this is a B-Sides, and I'm not a very exciting speaker, I decided to make my talk a little less boring by making it themed. If you didn't notice from the intro there, we're going to use the band Rage Against the Machine to help explain the problem today, which I immediately decided I had to do when the opening slide was a public service announcement. So let's get started. What is impersonation? Well, impersonation as a cybersecurity risk falls into the category of insider threat. An insider threat is something that's difficult to detect because most tools are really focused on external threats, and internal threat programs with formal capabilities to be able to identify impersonation are very rare in my experience. You have to have mature governance, monitoring, visibility, identity security, alerting to find it, or you're going to be relying on your team to notice. And that's really why I put this talk together. As a CISO, I dealt with a number of impersonation cases, and as a consultant, I've observed that most companies don't have the ability to detect these. So what are some examples of impersonation? It looks something like this, and this is one more attempt to play audio. This is a video called "The North Korean Military Choir Performs Killing in the Name of." As described by the FBI public service announcement, people are committing and doing identity theft to get hired, claiming they're someone else, and then using that person's experience to get a job. And I hope we can get this to work for a moment. Well, it looks like it's not going to work, but if you haven't seen this, you can look it up on YouTube. Basically, you've got the Rage Against the Machine song "Killing in the Name of" dubbed over like a performance by the North Korean military choir. It's pretty funny. Sorry about the fail there. the next is a scenario that I've witnessed as a CISO, and I've dubbed it the onboarding bait and switch. So in this scenario, you interview and find a candidate that's qualified for a job, and you hire him. Then on the first day, a co-conspirator shows up and starts work. And I apologize to any Chris Cornell fans, but yes, this absolutely happens. Sometimes what will happen is the interviewee was paid by the candidate. Other times, the interviewee will find a few co-conspirators and they'll get hired, and then they'll have those folks go take the jobs for them. Usually what we see is someone who's really good at interviewing goes out and gets jobs and then finds co-conspirators to help them do this. I've seen this multiple times and with CrowdStrike and IRs. You might be asking yourself, well, how could someone pull this off? And so I have an example. Particularly at larger companies, and I can tell you this has been my experience more than once, when you're interviewing for a job, you'll interview with someone who's a hiring manager on a team, but they might not end up being your manager. They're one of the managers. And then they decide to offer you a job, and you're going to start, and you might come back 1 month, 2 months, even 3 months later. So especially if your hiring manager that you talked to on your first day isn't the one who interviewed you, you could see how there's a possibility in a fully remote, you were remotely interviewed and your job is remote, you could pull this off. So related to onboarding bait and switch, and what might be a goal of it is what I've dubbed unauthorized outsourcing. So unauthorized outsourcing is when someone gets other people, external parties to the organization where they're employed, to do their work for them. I've got a couple of examples here. So I had one case where a subcontractor called us up and they said that they had to fire one of their employees because she told them she was getting help doing her work. They wouldn't tell us who was helping her other than that she had some reports that she couldn't explain, so they kind of pressed her on it, and she eventually admitted that she was having help. The assumption here is that, perhaps a partner or a family member or a friend was helping her. We never really found out, but we did have to write it up as an incident and report it to the agencies that she was doing work for. She could have been farming it out to consultants at Upwork or something more sinister. We just don't know. In another case, it was reported that someone showed up to a team meeting and gave a presentation to the team on something they had been working on for weeks. And the team reported to us they didn't recognize this person, the face or their voice. However, this person used the name of the person we had hired, and it appeared they were the one who had done the work. We investigated that one and found that their corporate laptop had an unauthorized installation on TeamViewer on it, pulled the logs, and found out that there were regular connections from a host and an IP address located in Asia. And this person eventually also admitted that they had someone else helping them do their work. So these cases, they happen far more often than people realize. I think there's a number of reasons why, but companies tend to not report them unless they have to, unless it materially affects the business. They generally don't report insider cases, or if it goes public on its own. So in the forefront, that's tool singer Menard James Keenan. He was a guest singer on one of Rage Against the Machine songs. All right, another problem that's related is multiple jobs. Sometimes people hold down multiple full-time jobs themselves. If you haven't come across this, very common. You might be surprised just how common this is. So this is what it looks like. At a former job, we caught someone who was not only working for us as a contractor, but who also had 2 government jobs. Seriously, this person was working 3 jobs and collecting 3 paychecks for at least some period of time before we figured it out. We fired them, we notified the government. Who knows what they did? They probably eventually fired him, but that can take quite a long time. And it turns out this is a common problem, at least with US government contractors. I've talked to numerous CISOs that found the same thing. It seems like it's easy to get away with, at least in the government contracting world, if you're fully remote. So what's the problem? Well, it really depends on what your employment agreement says. It may or may not violate the terms of that agreement to have multiple jobs. I think that most private companies today, they want you to report if you have any other job. There's definitely concerns about confidentiality and the access to the information that you have across multiple jobs. And that together could also constitute a conflict of interest. If you don't recognize Tom Morello, the lead guitarist for Rage Against the Machine, that's him touring with a bunch of other bands. There's even a site now called overemployed.com where people share tips on how to work multiple full-time jobs. Pretty interesting if you take a look at that. Employers are being impersonated as well. Threat actors will impersonate recruiters to steal your information. And there are lots of other scams that are related. And this even happens in InfoSec. This happened last year to my friends at Graylog. They found a scammer and posted publicly about it. And here's a quick summary. So this scammer registered a lookalike domain. So they registered graylog.com except with a second L. So unless you look very carefully, you might not notice. Then they used sketchy recruiting firms to solicit job applicants. Those applicants were then sent a fake check to pay for office equipment and told to use Zelle to send payment to office equipment vendors. Well, those vendor accounts belong to the scammers. So they sent you a fake check, they had you buy stuff, and you never got anything, and they got your money. So this is a quick summary of impersonation cases. There's probably a lot more variations, but with a 20-minute time slot, I just wanted to hit some kind of high points there. Next, how can you mitigate against them? Well, let's start with prevention. So my high-level recommendation here is if you don't have one, think about developing an insider threat program. And once you get there, also think about developing an impersonation playbook. And consider some of the things that I have mentioning on my next slide, or my next few slides. If you don't want people working multiple full-time jobs, then legally include that in your employment agreement and inform people of that. You should also have a solid acceptable use policy that prevents unauthorized activity that would impersonate or allow them to outsource their job to others. You could also consider a travel or remote work policy. It's obviously more tricky in today's environment. To get the best talent, you may need to allow fully remote work. But you still could disallow work from outside the United States if you're not a global organization, or by exception, or monitor for people who are working from outside the United States or their primary location. It's not that hard to do. It's actually required for many US government contractors. And then, of course, clearly implement defined and granular role-based access controls to limit exposure to assets. These are some steps you could consider while interviewing candidates remotely, or doing things like unlocking accounts or even enrolling a new MFA device. Require cameras on for interviews, and with sufficient lighting to see the candidate's face. That was definitely a theme that we saw in multiple cases, was that when this was happening, the folks had a poorly lit room to even further mask their identity. Then do an ID check at each interview. I just got a new iPhone, and I had to do a live Zoom, do an ID check in order to enroll the MFA app on my new phone. And it took like 5 minutes. This is no big deal. And the way that we implemented this for hiring at a previous job was for each interview, HR would start the interview with the candidate, and they would do an ID check. And they would get a screenshot of the person sharing their ID, and they would store it during the interviewing process. And I don't want to talk about the privacy implications of that at the moment. We did have an archive process. But basically then, after grabbing a screenshot and doing an ID check, they would let the interviewer into the call, and the interviewer would take over and do their interview. We also required the hiring manager to attend as many of the calls as possible, and the last one before waiting for the candidate to start their job. Also consider basic enrollment, biometric enrollment with new hires in person at an office. So what are some ways you can detect impersonation cases? Well, starting with onboarding, make offer letters contingent on background checks. And this is one of those things you have to look at the legality of and the way that people interpret doing this. But not only a criminal check, but you can also run credit checks and other type of background checks. And one that's, I think, really high value, if you haven't thought about this, is doing a payroll check. If you have a vendor like ADP or Paychex, you can ask them if a candidate is already receiving paychecks from another organization. Depending on your relationship with them, I've found that they've always given us the answer. And we've used this to not only find out during the hiring process that someone had another full-time job, but also while they were working for us. Obviously things like working at Lowe's on the weekend or something doesn't matter. We're looking for other full-time jobs here. More suggestions for identifying impersonation once you've hired people. Have cameras on for team meetings or for manager one-on-ones. As I mentioned earlier, enhanced identity protection with conditional access, and look at your alerts for impossible travel. So many companies don't pay attention to those alerts. It just boggles my mind that you're not looking at alerts from your IAM tools and from your VPN tools on impossible travel. The last two here might be the most important. Train managers on how to detect possible impersonation cases or cases of unauthorized outsourcing, what indicators to look for, and when to engage that impersonation protocol, that playbook that you've built. And last, developing a security-first culture. This is something that's huge at CrowdStrike. I can't go into a lot of details, but we really train staff that if they see something, to say something. And the company rewards diligence. And I did this myself. At my last role as a CISO, one of the first things I did was created challenge coins for the company. And they were cyber champion challenge coins. And we would give them out to people as rewards for people who identified like serious phishing scams or other potential incidents or vulnerabilities and risks that we weren't aware of. We actually gave the first one to an accounting manager who stopped payment on a smishing attempt to pay like $20,000. It was just going to breeze through. She called us, and so we publicly rewarded her and gave her the first challenge coin. CrowdStrike's insider risk team told me when I asked them some questions before doing this talk that it's a major focus of theirs to build that security-first culture and simultaneously try to not come off as Big Brother. So last, how do you respond to an impersonation case? Well, first and foremost, follow your documented processes. That impersonation protocol, if you put together a playbook, follow your documentation and involve HR and legal. It's so important with insider cases to involve HR and legal because you really need to be careful to abide by applicable laws and don't make any mistakes that could lead to lawsuits. I've also seen that happen. Use the data that you have, interview screenshots, geolocation data, asset inventory, configuration information. Use your IR firm, maybe perform your own OSINT or even hire a private investigator if you need to. So these are my main takeaways. Impersonation and fraud in hiring and employment are far more common than you think. You should develop employment agreements and policies that are necessary to protect your organization. Consider developing an insider threat program, and as I say here, in collaboration with HR and legal. And developing a specific playbook for impersonation cases in collaboration with HR and legal. That's it. Thanks for coming. That QR code is my LinkedIn, and I'll be around for the rest of the day if anyone wants to talk anymore.
That was great. Thank you, Russell. Thank you.